The Summer Games Minute, brought to you by Mass Mutual. For most professional athletes, versatility means they can play a few different positions in a single sport. For Babe Dietrichson-Zacharias, versatility means dominance across the entire spectrum of sport. In the 1932 Summer Games in Los Angeles, Zacharias won gold in the 80-meter hurdles and the javelin throw, plus she got a silver in the high jump. Running, throwing, jumping wasn't enough for Babe, so she became a competitive billiards player, then jumped into professional golf, winning 10 major championships, all the while making a few pitching appearances in Major League Baseball spring training games. Mass Mutual understands the nuances in how women want and need to manage their finances. With quality product solutions and guidance, a Mass Mutual financial professional can help you plan for both short-term and long-term money goals. Learn more and get started at massmutual.com.
Ryan Reynolds here from Mint Mobile. With the price of just about everything going up during inflation, we thought we'd bring our prices down. So to help us, we brought in a reverse auctioneer, which is apparently a thing.
Mint Mobile Unlimited Premium Wireless. How to get 30, 30, bit to get 30, bit to get 20, 20, 20, bit to get 20, 20, bit to get 15, 15, 15, 15, just $15 a month? Sold! Give it a try at mintmobile.com/switch.
$45 up front for 3 months plus taxes and fees. Promo rate for new customers for limited time. Unlimited more than 40 gigabytes per month. Slows full terms at mintmobile.com.
The Athletic.
The race is on, and it's never too early in the year to delve into the F1 driver market, and there's huge potential for a big shake-up in 2025. But who are the key players? And based on what we know now, how is the grid likely to look in 12 months' time? I'm Edd Straw, and joining us to evaluate the landscape and extrapolate the most likely deals has got Mitchell-Malm and Ben Anderson. Well, Ben, we'll come to you first. This is one of those poison chalice topics, isn't it? A great opportunity for us all to be wrong.
Yes, absolutely. Everyone loves a bit of driver market chat. I know I do. A lot of it will be guesswork at this point. Some things we can probably chart a fairly accurate course, but it will be fun. The journey will be fun, and hopefully everyone will enjoy coming with us.
Absolutely. And Scott Mitchell-Malm, obviously you're famous for your extremely precise driver market predictions, such as that great Alonso statement you made a few years ago.
I was wondering where you were going with that, because I was like, this feels like sarcasm, but I don't really understand. Like, don't think I've ever been mocked either way for that. And then obviously, yes, I remember famously the Alonso claim, which actually I almost feel I actually would quite like for that to be dropped into the podcast at this point.
For those of us who can't remember, what was the claim?
That was me. That was on the post-race Hungary podcast must have been 22, in which we were obviously talking about Alonso's situation. Everybody in their mums thought that Alonso was re-signing for Alpine, and it was a done deal. And then I said at the very end of the podcast something along the lines of Alonso's going to have like the Alpine deal done. He's not going to go away, meet Lawrence Stroll over the summer break and do a deal for Aston or something along those lines. And then literally 14 hours later, he was announced, or we were doing another podcast on Alonso's shock move to Aston Martin. So yeah, that was it was akin to. It was akin to when Ricciardo stitched us all up. Do you remember in 20, what would that have been, 18?
Well, he changed his mind on a flight, didn't he? He was all set for Red Bull. He had the deal he wanted, and then, just changed his mind suddenly.
I was at that test at Budapest. It was the second day after, it must have been the second day after the Hungarian Grand Prix, basically, cusp of the summer break.
Yes, I went to that race and we left you behind, I think.
I spoke to Ricciardo, at that test, and he just said, just basically they're now going to do the contract, so expect it all to be sorted by the end of the summer break. And it wasn't just being vague where you could then slot in Renault into that. He was explicitly talking about Red Bull, but then he literally changed.
Yeah, he meant it. He meant it at the time. At that point, that was exactly what he expects to happen.
Yeah, he did. He changed his mind on his flight to America for his summer holidays. So I need to stop making driver market claims around the summer break. That's clearly the trend here, which means January. This is the perfect time for me to do it. How could I be wrong?
Yeah, you definitely can't preface anything you say with "Here we go," because you just don't have the crystal ball, do you?
And also
the
because I'm not a little
ball.
bit of an attention-seeking social media goober. So,
Well, it's illustrative of the fact that the unexpected can happen, and usually the decision makers, it's only a couple of decision makers. It's not like a big thing and the wheels turn. Sometimes deals look set to be done and then they suddenly swerve, opportunities come up. So it kind of underlines how difficult it is to do what we're trying to do. But really, trying to anticipate the 2025 driver lineup is primarily about understanding the landscape and where things look like they might go now, and then as it evolves, because it will evolve. If we talked about this early in 2022, we'd have been completely blindsided by things, because there were people with firm contracts like Pierre Gasly who weren't where they were going to be until quite late on in the season. So what we're going to do is talk through the various teams and drivers based on what we know now and can predict, try and work out what a likely shape of the grid is in 2025. And we've got our spreadsheet open. We're going to slot names in as we go along. So at the end, we can revisit our full lineup, and then maybe in 12 months' time, we can see how accurate we are. Difficult task, but an interesting one. So, Ben, we're going to start off with Mercedes, primarily because that's potentially an easy one. Both Lewis Hamilton and George. Well, we like to give you a nice, easy, soft starter.
Banker.
But Lewis Hamilton and George Russell are confirmed for 2025 already. So really,
Done.
the only potentially disruptive factor would be if Hamilton were to retire. Should we dismiss that? Should we dismiss that possibility, and leave Hamilton and Russell bolded up in our list of 25 driver lineups?
So the only thing that could change this is an absolute mammoth bombshell retirement.
Exactly, a seismic move.
Okay, I wouldn't rule it out completely, because I think Hamilton expressed at the end of last season some doubt in himself, some general uncertainty. If the Mercedes is a dog of a car again, I can see him questioning anew his commitment. He doesn't have to see out the contract, does he, really? He's powerful enough and successful enough, so he could walk away. And in that situation, then I imagine George Russell becomes team leader. And then, a bit like when Nico Rosberg suddenly retired after winning the World Championship, everyone is calling up Toto Wolff. Maybe not everyone, because they're not quite as successful, but a lot of people will be trying to call him up to engineer themselves into that second seat alongside Russell. But
so it'll be bring back Bottas.
Bring back Bottas. I mean, he'd be on the list, maybe. But I think he'd be a bit further down, compared to drivers like maybe Alex Albon, maybe Sainz if he's fed up with Ferrari. Obviously, Mercedes are quite excited about Antonelli, Andrea Kimi Antonelli, as an up-and-comer. It'd be a bit soon for him. So I think they'd probably like to hold on a few years and blood him in somewhere else before eventually promoting him when Hamilton does stop. So all bets are off if Hamilton retires, basically. But I would imagine he would see out the contract, because I think when he weighs it all, he still loves racing. And if he has enough moments like Hungary last year, the qualifying lap, where he knows he can access the old magic and feel what it's like to beat the rest of the grid, that will be enough to keep him going.
Yeah, I think we really have to leave this as is. He signed the 2-year deal.
Yeah.
It could change, and it would completely change everything that then follows. But I think we have to assume that'll be the case and leave that Mercedes lineup as is, unless you want to dissent, Scott.
No, I think that covers it all quite nicely. There are potential variables that can throw it. Whether Lewis does decide to call it a day, whether Mercedes gets it so wrong that neither driver wants to be there, whether or not those two crash into each other and it becomes untenable, and whatever, one of them is driven away for whatever reason. But all of those feel unlikely enough, because even things like the two of them colliding, while I can see that happening again in 2024, it has to be just such a outrageously controversial kind of collision, or like a series of collisions, for it to make the partnership toxic and something.
It's nowhere near as poisonous as Rosberg Hamilton was over a number of years.
No, exactly.
It could go that way, but it would take a long time to get there, I think.
Exactly. So you're talking that level of toxicity to really break it down. So and as we've talked about before, and I think as we voted on in an article that we've done on the website, and I think a video as well that is on or is going to be on our YouTube channel, we all just about think that the Mercedes lineup is still the best in Formula One overall. So Mercedes is certainly going to want to keep it going.
Yeah, exactly. So we have to just bear in mind there's the potential for a curveball, but balance of probability now, it will be as is. And let's actually move on to Ferrari now, which is the team that I consider to have the best driver lineup because I really like how well balanced it is. But Scott, what's the state of play there? Can we put them down to stay unchanged? Neither is officially confirmed for 25 as yet.
No, neither are locked in. I think we can pencil Charles Leclerc in, though. I see that only going in one direction. He loves Ferrari. He's bought into Fred Vasseur's vision. I don't think he has a better alternative on the table, or an obviously better alternative on the table. You could argue that he could probably fashion a move to Mercedes if he wanted, but I honestly think that that's better the Red Bull inferior team, in that scenario. So I think Leclerc sticks where he is. Sainz, though, I'm going to do a disclaimer at this point. I'm being as optimistic and interesting as possible with my thoughts about what the driver market does for 2025. I think Sainz moves on for 2025. I think there will be a point in the negotiations, and I'm obviously teeing up a Sainz announcement in the next 48 hours or so saying this.
Here we go.
Yeah, there's a point in the negotiations where Sainz realises that actually he isn't going to get medium to long term out of Ferrari what he wants. And he wants to be somewhere where if he isn't going to be top dog at Ferrari in a team where he can fight for wins possibly in the short term, he wants to set himself up longer term. I think Ferrari would be happy to offer him a 1 year deal or a 1+1. Sainz wants a bit more certainty than that. So I think in the end, Sainz will be minded to go elsewhere, and Ferrari won't be unhappy with that because there are some good options. So Ed, can I position a different name in place of Sainz for Ferrari, and can I indicate where I think Sainz ends up?
Well, yes, you can. We'll have to decide whether we all agree with it, but you can certainly propose what will happen.
I think Alex Albon ends up in the Ferrari in 2025 alongside Leclerc, and I think Sainz gambles on the Audi project longer term and moves to what we currently know as Stake to head up the would-be Audi Works program longer term.
Interesting. I must admit, I'm inclined to think Sainz will stay at Ferrari. I think he's too good a teammate for Leclerc, and I think...
Look, if you're inclined to be boring, I can't stop
I'm always inclined to be boring, but that makes things very interesting because that means it's 1-1. So Ben actually has all the power here. He gets the casting vote. Do we go with Scott's admittedly far more interesting possibility, or do we stick with as is?
So I have to choose between those two options. I can't throw something else into the mix.
Well, you can throw a third one and we can continue to fight it out for a bit. Whatever you think will happen.
Make it a three-way tie.
I do think Scott has outlined the key hold-up in that Sainz wants more certainty out of Ferrari. And if he doesn't get that, he has to vote with his feet, doesn't he? Or just accept it. I wondered if he... In a hypothetical scenario where Ferrari doesn't give him what he wants, yes, I agree Alex Albon is a good shout for that second seat. He's been teammates with Leclerc before, I think, in the junior category.
Yeah, in GP3, yeah. Yeah, they battled for the GP3 title.
And is known to like a car balance similar to Leclerc, so that could work quite well in terms of dovetailing the two drivers. What about Fernando Alonso's situation at Aston Martin, the special relationship he has with the Sainz family, and Sainz being considered a kind of natural successor to be a team leader at Aston Martin? I feel like Audi, I know there's been links because of the former McLaren administration taking over there, but I just feel like that's a bit of a too soon backward step for a driver performing as high at as high a level as Sainz is now. That's not to say Audi won't lift the team maybe, but that feels like it's quite a few years away. Effectively, you're joining midfield Sauber.
What Audi would offer Sainz is a lot of money because they're desperate to get a high-quality driver lineup and a long-term deal. It would at least be a 2+1 deal. He'd probably be able to get a bit more out of them potentially. So that's the appeal. But to me, that feels like such a
cashing out.
It does feel like cashing out. Yeah, that's the downside for me.
Can we completely rule out? I'm not saying this would be the casting factor, but can we rule out the fact that Senior's obviously got strong Audi links as being just something that plays into it, whether it's knowing the right people, speaking to the right people, getting a favourable deal, even maybe on a sentimental level, if you're talking like 1% maybe of the thing, the idea of both Sainz is competing for the same manufacturer, is that completely off the table as something relevant?
It'll help, but I don't think there needs to be anything selling to Audi and stake on Sainz. I think they'd sign him up on a very favourable deal in a heartbeat if he picked up the phone to Andreas Seidel today and said, right, let's do a 2+1 for a big pile of money. I think it would happen. So it would be nice, and there'd be a nice alignment. And obviously, Carlos Sr. has had a role in Sainz's career before. Sainz was on the Red Bull programme basically because of Carlos's connection with Red Bull. He wasn't a highly valued asset by Marco, incorrectly I should add, because Sainz was a very, very good driver and he was an asset to Red Bull. But so it's not unprecedented, but I'm not sure it's, like you say, it could be a small thing that's a nice alignment, but I don't really see it swinging anything it needs to swing or changing anything. Because if I'm Carlos Jr., I'll be looking and thinking, I am signing up to not win another race for at least 3 years.
Right, I'm going to use my casting vote and say that Sainz actually bites his tongue, accepts the short-term Ferrari deal for 2025, and then takes over from Alonso at Aston in 2026 when Alonso retires. So Sainz stays at Ferrari.
Boo! Let it be said, I disagree with this completely.
No, that's fine. Well, it's funny because on the one hand, I should be quite pleased because Ben has agreed with my analysis of the situation, but it's made it much more dull. But
sorry,
again,
listeners.
this does show we've hit two teams that some of us anyway are fairly confident will be unchanged, but they've both got elements where there could be seismic impact. So that tells you how important it is. And in fact, Ferrari is the kind of next domino to fall, I suspect, in this, and that will have a big impact on the rest of the driver market. We've already mentioned drivers like Albon's probably the driver with the most potential destinations for 25, I would argue, given the kind of roles that he would appeal to for a team. But we'll stick with Leclerc Sainz. So we'll get things a little bit more lively in subsequent sections, and we've got a great one coming up in a moment.
You know we love talking stats here at The Athletic. Here's one that's super simple to remember. Discover automatically doubles the cash back you've earned on your credit card at the end of your first year with Cash Back Match. That means with Discover, you could turn $150 cash back to $300. That's right, you could put it towards some memorabilia you've had your eye on or treat yourself to a premium sports network. You earn and Discover doubles. See terms at discover.com/credit card.
We'll get back to the pod in a moment, but first of all, let me tell you about Grammarly. Email, Google Docs, Slack, you write across multiple platforms and places during your workday, so delivering consistent, high-quality communication everywhere is key. Grammarly is an AI writing partner that helps you get work done faster with high-quality writing for better projects, proposals, presentations, and more. Best of all, Grammarly works where you work, so you can get more done no matter what tools you use. As a journalist and podcast host, I'm constantly writing and rewriting copy and drawing up scripts. It's part of the job, and Grammarly helps make it faster. It's got some really cool features like tone suggestions to help you strike the right balance between direct and friendly in work emails. Plus, Grammarly has a ton of other great features like advanced spelling, grammar, punctuation, and conciseness suggestions to ensure your writing is professional, mistake-free, and clear. Get AI writing support that works where you work. Sign up and download for free at grammarly.com/podcast. That's GRAMMARLY.com/podcast. Easier said, done. Right, Ben, we'll come on to Red Bull now. We've left this to third, even though they're the top team, because it's quite a complicated one. We can draw the team formerly known as AlphaTauri into this discussion as well, because it's the same driver ecosystem. Yeah. So the big question is, what happens with Perez? How does that impact Daniel Ricciardo, and what does that mean for the rest of the driver market?
Yeah, well, this apart from whether Sainz stays or not at Ferrari is this is the top domino, isn't it? This will dictate everything else, really. Although
it's a weird domino because quite often the Red Bull system dominoes are in their own little internal sealed off space. Contained. But sometimes it does drift outside. So that's the interesting question. It could have a seismic impact, or it could actually be very localised in a weird kind of way.
I do feel like when Perez was at his lowest ebb last season, that Red Bull would have quite happily dipped outside the pool to find a replacement. And maybe it's just coincidental, but I felt like the McLaren renewal of Piastri and trying to shore up the Norris situation was very much a sort of preemptive strike there, because if I was Red Bull, I definitely would have had my eyes on both of their drivers.
Well, we know for sure that Red Bull like Norris and have kind of sniffed around a little bit there.
Yeah, and Piastri obviously was someone who had flirtations with the Red Bull scheme in his junior single-seater days, and he looks like the real deal, doesn't he? So he'd be a great, raw option to slot in alongside. They've got to consider what happens with Verstappen. Obviously, he's contracted until 2028, the end of time, but could just walk away at any moment. He's that sort of Senna-type driver who has the power to just decide his own future in a heartbeat. So they have to consider in the background who succeeds him. So I don't think it's quite as simple as just saying, I know that keep an older driver in the second car and we'll be fine, because they could end up a couple of years or even a season after 25 without Verstappen. But just focusing on the short term, Perez is in pole position. I think if he raises his game enough, they'll keep him on a much shorter deal. I don't think they'd give him another 2-year contract. It's obviously a hassle to change drivers. I think probably Red Bull will really want Ricciardo to step on. I kind of feel like that's maybe the most natural fit for them, especially when you consider his popularity and the marketing potential he offers them, the pre-existing relationship he gets on with Verstappen. I don't think you would have the kind of weird Monaco 2022 fallout type situation between Verstappen and Ricciardo that you had with Verstappen and Perez. But I'm not convinced yet about Ricciardo. That if you just looked at it objectively right now, probably the best, it's marginal, but the best driver they have within the ecosystem is Tsunoda. But they don't have the pressure of Honda anymore, or even the backing of Honda's coming up to really force that issue. So Tsunoda's the uncomfortable one, because if he continues to remain faster than Ricciardo, it's quite difficult to say, Ricciardo's a shoe-in for the Perez seat. Also, the second team needs the experience of someone like Ricciardo to help push it along. He's definitely made an impact there with his experience. Tsunoda's not really a team leader driver. They've got Lawson to consider, somebody they probably want to... who knows if he's negotiated AlphaTauri driver, whatever it's going to be called, on the back of his reserve deal.
I think on Lawson, do we think we should pencil him in at Red Bull 2? Let's call it that.
Yeah, I do
for next year, because I think it's surely inevitable he'll be there next year.
I feel like if we're taking this as a whole, then the most sensible lineup at Red Bull 2 is Ricciardo Lawson. Once they've decided, Tsunoda, the Honda money, we don't need it anymore, what have you. So Tsunoda kind of, I don't see him graduating to Red Bull's A team, even if he deserves it. So he's got to look outside. So I kind of end up in a situation where it's Verstappen, Perez, Ricciardo, Lawson for 2025. That's how I see it.
Interesting.
I think there's a reasonable chance of an all new AlphaTauri Red Bull 2 lineup for 2025. But the problem with that is it does go against what that team wants to be, which is less of a junior team, more of a sister team. Which I really is not shown any evidence of being that, but that's what they keep wanting to call it, and they want to have that mix of experience and youth. So by their own metric of what they want to judge their driver lineup against, Ricciardo and Lawson makes the most sense. But I don't think it's impossible to see something like a Lawson Isaac Hadjar lineup in 2025. There's something about Hadjar that Red Bull quite likes. There's something about Hadjar that Edd Straw quite likes. And if there's I can see a scenario whereby Hadjar does like one thing that wins over Helmut Marko, and he just goes, no, I want him in a Formula 1 car next season.
Yeah, he's an interesting driver, Hadjar. He certainly hasn't done enough as yet to justify being given the drive, but I was quite impressed with his Mexico FP1 outing. I followed that one closely. He's got a good approach. So yeah, he's an interesting one. I think the point you make about what they want the second Red Bull team lineup to be, I think that'll all be secondary to as it will always be, no matter what rhetoric they use, it will always be secondary to the main team. So they will decide on what works for the main team based on what works for the main team, and then Red Bull 2 will do whatever. So I must admit, I can see a scenario where Perez saves his seat. I think if he focuses on being Sergio Perez in terms of the way he drives and approaches things rather than trying to match Verstappen, if he builds on the progress he made right at the end of the year, the approach, the experimentation he did in the Abu Dhabi test, where he could actually focus on what he was doing, then he could do it. However, I feel like that team, they want a good solid number 2 who works well for the team. And I can see, even if Ricciardo isn't absolutely stunning in the second team, I can see them thinking, actually, we don't think Ricciardo's going to be, we don't think he's going to be a downgrade on Perez, and he'll probably be a slight upgrade. So I'm sort of leaning towards Ricciardo ending up in that Red Bull seat. But I think if I was Red Bull, I'd be looking at something completely different. But I've got a very different philosophy of what I do with drivers to Red Bull. So that's the way I look at it, the direction they seem to be funneling towards.
There's obviously a few avenues for them to go down with it, and I've put in my provisional list for this, in my suggestions, I've put Ricciardo in the second car, because I can see a scenario in which Red Bull goes for the path of least resistance, which isn't actually keeping the incumbent driver. It's putting in the driver that's one, in the nicest way possible to Ricciardo, because I don't want it to just make it sound like he's happy making up the numbers. He will be damn grateful for that seat. And there's a little bit of a happy to be here vibe about his F1 comeback. It's not the overriding thing, but there's a gratitude that he has vocalised quite strongly through 2023. We know that his
outlook has changed a lot from when he left, for primarily reasons of Verstappen getting the ascendancy.
Yes, exactly. So I just think he would be a much less divisive option, because we know that at the moment Perez won't accept, or doesn't want to accept, that he can't beat Verstappen, and there's just the opportunity every now and then for a little bit of needle. I think they get on. I do think it is blown out of proportion that they're, it's a divided driver lineup or anything like that. I think Ricciardo's just a slightly simpler option for them, and ultimately, even if we're not 100% convinced by Ricciardo, they're basically the same option in terms of on-track ability, because they're not going to rival Verstappen. They're going to have weekends where they're really good, and they're probably going to have some weekends, if Ricciardo's as sort of unconvincing as maybe he looked against Tsunoda, he's going to have weekends where he's a bit too far adrift. So when you balance it up like that, personally, if you did it purely on performance, I agree with what Ben said earlier, I'd put Tsunoda in the car. But clearly there's something about Tsunoda that Red Bull doesn't quite trust or believe in. I don't know if maybe they just don't think he'd handle it. So it's more of a mental thing rather than an ability thing.
I think that's definitely the concern there, just the ability to, and Tsunoda will talk about this himself, the emotional control and everything. He's talked about needing to learn that from Ricciardo. But yeah, I'd agree with you. I think Tsunoda proved himself to be quicker than Ricciardo. The only caveat we have to put against that is obviously Ricciardo had a limited programme that was interrupted. So I think we will get the fair view of where Ricciardo is over the first half of the coming year.
I would just say, to finish off my thoughts on this before Ben jumps in with another morale-sapping opinion of boredom, I'm sure.
You can't wait.
I've got, in addition to Ricciardo, got Ricciardo at Red Bull, Lawson, Hadjar as the Red Bull 2 lineup, and I have Perez staying on the grid somewhere else. I just wanted to drop that in.
Right, well, what do you want to go for, Ben, for Red Bull's second seat?
I want to throw in a curveball that we haven't considered.
Oh, here we go.
And that is a guy who will be out of contract at the end of 2024, who was linked with Red Bull before Sergio Perez took that drive, Nico Hülkenberg.
That's very out of left field. You could work for German media with that kind of outlook.
He could do a decent job for them.
I think. And because what I don't see happening is Perez coming out of Red Bull and being the team leader at the second team. They don't trust Tsunoda to be that leader. I don't think they can rely on a Lawson Hadjar lineup for what they want. So they need Ricciardo in place, especially if they're not convinced that he's really an upgrade on Perez. But Hülkenberg, I think, as left field, especially in these type of cars, I think he's quick and would work well with Verstappen. He'd be cheap.
There is a factor that goes against that, though, because one of the things we know about Verstappen is he's not a big fan of doing all the sponsor stuff and all those appearances, and keeps that to a minimum. He's got the power to do that. So you want a second driver who's really good at that. Daniel Ricciardo is probably the best on the grid for that. Nico Hülkenberg, I would say
so much.
it's not top of his strengths to do that. So that, I think, in the wider perspective, might count against him a little bit.
And to be fair, when he was teammates with Ricciardo at Renault, it's nip and tuck. I mean, so I don't think necessarily Hülkenberg's a guaranteed upgrade in terms of pace.
Ricciardo
Maybe
did
if he
have
gets
the
on
edge
better
there,
with these
although I think the formula has gone a bit more against Ricciardo since then.
and maybe a bit more in Hülkenberg's favour. I think he'd have the right mentality. The concern with even a left field external option like an Albon is, again, like I don't think Red Bull would trust the mentality. What you said, Scott, about Tsunoda and Edd, you backed up, not being trusted to cope. Obviously, Albon's rebuilt himself, but he was shattered by being Verstappen's teammate, and I think Red Bull will be wary of that. Plus, they've got 5 drivers for 4 seats already, so it's quite inefficient to be like, oh, we still need to dip outside the pool. So, rounding it all up, I'm actually going to go with your suggestion of Ricciardo in that seat.
Okay, I think we're unanimous on Ricciardo, and I should stress this is what we are predicting will happen rather than what we want to happen. It's based on what we think is the most likely.
Yeah.
Can I just throw in quickly, because I think we need to discuss it, even if we dismiss it. Can we completely rule out Red Bull just paying through the nose to buy out Norris's contract?
I don't think we can rule out them trying to do that, but how much would McLaren need for that to happen? I guess maybe if they got a shed load of money and could get
I think
a
50 million plus.
Even then, why?
But they don't need to, because Verstappen is so good in that car, is so good. I just don't think they need a second driver of that quality. I mean, if they suddenly find that Merc, Ferrari, McLaren are all over them, and Verstappen can't do it by himself, then they will need to panic buy somebody. But I really think they could plug the least offensive option into that second car, someone who can tick over the points board, and they don't really need to worry about them being super competitive. So I'd rule that out.
I can't see McLaren being willing to sell Norris for that amount. I think they have to sell much higher. I think Red Bull would be willing to pay serious money, but I just look at it and think, yes, Piastri has made a great start. He's still got some progress to make on his race performances in terms of time management. That's perfectly normal for a rookie, and I'm sure he will. But I just think the tariff for McLaren would be so high. I guess it's the last year of Norris's contract, so that could play into it. If Norris said...
You know that someone like Alex Albon's on the market as well?
Potentially. I mean, we know McLaren do like Albon, so it's possible. I just can't see it being a good reflection on McLaren's ambition. It's more likely if McLaren doesn't kick on as hoped in 2024. That's certainly the case. But if McLaren carries on the trajectory, really?
In fairness, Scott, if Piastri keeps giving Norris a hard time, that might combust a little bit at McLaren. And actually, Norris would be the automatic successor to Verstappen, I think, if you had a blank slate. So if Red Bull genuinely felt like they were going to lose Verstappen early, I could see them making a big play to get Norris. Piastri slots into that position, and then someone like Albon, I agree, would be a good player to slot in alongside Piastri at McLaren without them really losing too much, because they're so convinced that Piastri can be the real thing.
Or bring back Sainz if he's available.
Yeah.
I just think a factor within all of that is ultimately like what Norris wants, because if McLaren kicks on with the relationship that he's got there and the fact that at the moment he's top dog, he's going to have an amazing contract at the moment, and a new one would be even more lucrative for him, I'm sure. But if there's any doubt about McLaren for Norris, if there's any sign that Red Bull is seriously interested, if Norris isn't going to sign a new contract, it's not a reflection of McLaren's ambition to then go, well, if we're losing him at the end of 25 anyway, might as well cash in.
Yeah.
And then we get a driver who we think, okay, maybe he's not got the absolute last 0.1% of pace as Norris, someone like Alex Albon, but he's going to be a great option to have alongside Piastri in the medium term. Get him in instead. Like, I can see
That's fair,
that happening. It doesn't change my pick now, because I think that requires McLaren to slip up badly from where they ended 2023. But I just wanted that. I feel like we needed due diligence. We needed to have that Norris discussion.
Yeah.
It doesn't dissuade. But it doesn't dissuade. I just think it's like maybe a year too early.
I think it all depends really on where McLaren is. There's no doubt Norris' desire will be to ride the McLaren train to race wins and championship pushes. I don't think he'd forsake a McLaren that's doing that or looking like it's about to do that in order to be Verstappen's teammate at Red Bull. I'm not sure that's a great trade-off. But yes, there are scenarios where the equation could change quite a little bit. So yeah, it was worth raising that I think. But I think we've got Ricciardo in the second Red Bull seat for now, and we can get on to McLaren now, Scott, because along with Mercedes, it's the second and final team to have a lineup confirmed. Lando Norris under contract to the end of 25, Piastri to the end of 26. So we've addressed already a little bit the forces that might change there, but for what we're doing now, we have to expect that to be the same in 25, don't we?
Yeah, I don't think we need to dwell on this one much at all. We've pretty much covered the main factor for McLaren in that previous little end of the Red Bull segment. I think it all depends on whether or not McLaren has done enough to keep Norris convinced. I don't think, and this is sincere because obviously Mercedes and Ferrari I think have underachieved versus where they are. I don't think McLaren needs to be the second best team in F1 this year for Norris to still buy into it and to still believe actually this is on the trajectory it needs to be. I think if they're in that mix, I think they have to be top 4 in the championship, certainly. I think what they can't do is can't afford to slip behind an Aston or an Alpine. But if they're sniping at Red Bull occasionally and properly in the mix against Mercedes and Ferrari, I think Norris is sort of locked in still in that medium term for the duration of his contract and doesn't want out. And if he doesn't want out, I don't see a Red Bull, even if they want him, swooping for him. So therefore Norris stays because he's under contract and Piastri's going nowhere. He knows that's a great place for him to be, certainly in the medium term.
Yeah, I think Norris's place at McLaren looks more secure than at any time in the last few years, the trajectory they're on. He clearly trusts Andrea Stella as well. He's spoken really highly of him, so it feels like that everything there is moving in the right direction. At the moment, he's got Piastri covered because Piastri, especially in the races, is just that bit weaker. So I think the only curveballs really are Norris deciding he doesn't want to stay beyond 2025, and as Scott outlined, whether McLaren needs to cash in on that before losing him for free, effectively, and whether the Piastri becomes so good so quickly that Norris becomes too uncomfortable in that situation. And a bit like Ricciardo did when he was at Red Bull the first time around, decides I need out because I don't like the way this is going. But these are unpredictable things in the future. I think this is probably the most secure of all the lineups we're discussing, so I wouldn't change it.
Right, let's move on to Aston Martin now, Ben. Neither Aston Martin driver is confirmed. So what do you think the future holds for Fernando Alonso and Lance Stroll?
Well, I think we probably would all agree that Lance Stroll is just eternally in that seat until such time as he either convinces his dad he's had enough and wants to do something else, or his dad's had enough and flogs the team. So I think Stroll's a lock, especially if the performance trajectory remains upward and he doesn't have another huge slump like he had in the middle of last year. I think, we got to Qatar and it was maybe on the bubble, but he's repaired that, I think, in the races since. Yeah,
the last 3 weekends picked up a bit and he was kind of back at that level where, he's not Alonso's level, solid. But you sort of look at him, you're thinking, okay, you can produce solid drives and bring home an amount of points.
And he seems to, with how he responded to the injury at the start of the season and then how he responded eventually to that mini slump, to have dug deep, found a little bit of maturity and some kind of inner steel. I think you spoke to him about this, Scott, actually, didn't you, at the end of last season? And it was kind of an encouraging sign that his, the sort of eternal misery that he exuded at Williams, that's not quite there anymore. Like, even when there are setbacks, he seems to have some bounce back ability.
Yeah, I think there's a degree of doubt over both drivers. I don't think either's 100% for 2025. I don't think it will go as far as an all-new driver lineup for Aston. My gut feeling is that Alonso will stay. But I think Stroll is kind of 50-50, maybe 60-40 likely to stay, because it's basically dependent, I think, on how he performs. Because I think if he had another season like 2023, where there were genuinely some cases of misfortune in that season that didn't help, but it wasn't the overall reason why he was so inferior to Alonso. So I don't think, in terms of what that team wants to achieve, I don't think Aston Martin, regardless of who owns the team, who's the chairman, would accept that level of performance longer term. But I also don't think Stroll himself will want to be in Formula One if that is his long-term future, just being teammate to someone who scores 8 podiums through a season, and Stroll gets nowhere near a podium, frankly. So I think there's a reasonable chance that Alonso has a new teammate in 2025. But I would say, one, given his scenario within the team, the circumstances, and two, the fact that he clearly isn't a driver without ability, it's in Stroll's hands. So gut feeling is Alonso Stroll probably carries on. But I will say, on my provisional list, because I didn't have him staying within the Red Bull family, I've actually got Tsunoda in here for 2 reasons.
Me too.
One, I just objectively think he deserves a place in Formula One. I think he's smoothened out enough of the rough edges that he does deserve a place on the grid. And I don't want to underestimate the potential influence of Honda 26 onwards. It's not the kind of deal where Honda's paying so much money to Aston Martin that they guarantee a second, they get driver choice or anything like that. But they will want a say. They have said this. They will be involved in the discussions to a degree. And I think there's just about enough of a performance argument that if you replace Stroll and Tsunoda was available, I think he'd be a really good option for them. But also, you denied me my Albon to Ferrari move. So I think actually Albon would be a fantastic option. He'd be an absolutely fantastic option for Aston Martin alongside Alonso.
Albon feels like a great option for that team if either of those drivers leave.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think he's he could slot in there as the leader or as the excellent, basically equal status driver in the quote-unquote second car.
Correct me if I'm wrong, though. Isn't Aston/Stroll paying Honda this time around? So the arrangement is a little bit backwards in the sense that Honda won't have quite as much say as they would have done in the past when they were paying through the nose to partner with a team.
Yeah, but that's what I was saying. I don't think they have a choice of the set. They don't have control of the second seat. But,
yeah, sure.
You know, they're in there as a partner regardless of the terms, and there'll be some potential to leverage there. And I'm sure if they decide that Tsunoda's the big Japanese hope, there's been, over the last 12 months or so, as I understand it, there's been a bit of like Honda deciding, is it Tsunoda or Iwasa that we back longer term as a Formula One driver, because we want a driver in Formula One. And I think Tsunoda's made a great case for himself, whereas Iwasa is kind of almost there, but he's got a bit of a make or break season this year to even get into F1 in the first place. And so if Honda's like, actually, it's much better for us, and it's better for interest in F1 in Japan for us to have a Japanese driver, I can see there being a conversation there about, right, what would it take? And you know, when you've got that potential element there plus the performance element, that's why Tsunoda enters the picture, in my opinion.
Yeah, I agree with that. I had Tsunoda on my, ideal list, if you like. I think he won't progress at Red Bull, but is, as I've said before, probably slightly better option than the ones they have. And I think
he should be considered by any of those teams in certainly the sort of 5th down to 10th vicinity, should we say. And
I figured too that the emerging Honda links or the future Honda links would make a compelling case if he continues to perform well. So I can definitely see a scenario where Stroll doesn't cut it, gets fed up again, and they decide to make a change. I think Alonso will almost certainly stay for 2025. I think he has an option, doesn't he, Ed? Anyway, to that extent?
I believe so. I'm not 100% certain, but I'd assume that would be a 2+1, and I'm sure the option's on his side as well.
Yeah, exactly. And if that's the case, I think he'll just, unless everything falls apart spectacularly and unexpectedly, I think he's a lock.
Well, we've got Alonso, I think, as the one. So the real question is what we say with Stroll. It's difficult, isn't it? Because there is a way out for Stroll. He could go and do the Valkyrie sports car project and go there, and I'm sure he could do a good job in that. So that's the big question. What probability we put on Stroll?
Yeah, I if I have to weigh it, I think it's maybe just slightly too soon for him to call it quits. Again, I think the team kind of needs to plateau, or he needs to have a elongated disaster and realise himself that he's plateaued to suddenly walk out. I think the fact that the end of last season was better will be enough to sustain him into this year, and providing this year is okay, I can just see him eking it out a bit longer. Personally, I don't think maybe that's the ideal driver lineup, but I feel like it's the most likely still.
Yeah,
I think
not the ideal driver lineup in that regard.
I can foresee, looking beyond to like 26 when Honda is involved, that it's suddenly like Tsunoda Sainz, for example. If what we said about Ferrari transpires, I could see him replacing Alonso there, or an Albon type, somebody else who's more highly rated than Stroll is.
Can I suggest that if we're going to go with the continuity option here as Alonso Stroll, that we pencil in, because I believe we did ultimately commit to Ricciardo for Red Bull. I think that means we pencil in a Lawson-Tsunoda lineup at Red Bull too, because I think Tsunoda, regardless of the fact that Honda link is fading there, if they want that experience and youth combination, by that point he'll have had enough seasons under his belt. He knows the team inside out. The performance is there. He's just the perfect no-brainer continuity option for Red Bull as well, just alongside bringing Lawson in as a full-time rookie.
Agreed.
So I think that takes care of it if we're not slotting him in at Aston Martin.
Okay, I can see a scenario where they might want to bring in another younger one, but you've both gone Tsunoda, so we'll put him there. And so are we sticking with Stroll?
Sorry, Isaac.
Are we sticking with Stroll with Aston Martin?
I think
so.
I think he edges it just.
It all feels very. I think Ben used the figure 60-40. I think we're all kind of in that same thing.
That was Scott.
Again, it becomes what If I was in Aston Martin's position, I'd be looking at getting in an Albon or a Sainz in that seat. But obviously, there's specific reasons why Stroll's there.
Yeah, I think the family connection probably edges it in a marginal decision. He stays, doesn't he?
Yeah, I agree. I would have and did have one or two drivers above Stroll on my list. But if we're going to go down that route, and obviously my original idea of Albon at Ferrari, I've found an alternative home for Albon where I think he ends up if Sainz ends up at Ferrari. So I'd have no problem with leaving Albon off of Aston Martin and having Aston Martin as a slightly boring continuity lineup.
And also, we've got to consider Drugovich, don't we? Who they've got hanging around as reserve driver and F2 champion. Is he just perennially hanging around as a reserve with no future?
I think so. I don't see him as I think if the one scenario is if Stroll has a terrible first half of the season or something,
just walks
Drugovich
away.
might get a chance and could change things. But I don't see the only serious interest in Drugovich in general I've seen from teams is when they thought he may have decent backing behind him that he can bring.
Okay.
So I'm not sure Drugovich is rightly or wrongly in a great position to get anything.
Okay.
Again, you never know, but I don't think Drugovich is a big threat for an Aston seat.
Okay, so we write him off as a full kit bench warmer, and it's simply a case of Alonso Stroll continuing or not. I think we're settled on Alonso Stroll then, aren't we? At least for 25. Probably.
Yeah, I think that's the most likely. But again, another one of those curveball asterisks. It'd be a desirable seat if he does decide he wants to move on to, say, sports cars. But we have to go with Alonso Stroll at the moment.
Ryan Reynolds here from Mint Mobile. With the price of just about everything going up during inflation, we thought we'd bring our prices down. So to help us, we brought in a reverse auctioneer, which is apparently a thing.
Mint Mobile Unlimited Premium Wireless. How to get 30, 30, bit to get 30, bit to get 20, 20, 20, bit to get 20, 20, bit to get 15, 15, 15, 15, just $15 a month? Sold!
Give it a try at mintmobile.com/switch.
$45 up front for 3 months plus taxes and fees. Promo rate for new customers for limited time. Unlimited more than 40 gigabytes per month. Slows full terms at mintmobile.com.
Right, Scott, let's get on to Alpine now. Neither driver's officially confirmed for 24. Esteban Ocon's out of contract. I think there's some kind of option for Pierre Gasly, so what happens there?
I think Pierre Gasly might do enough in 2024 to make this team his own. And I think in that scenario, given the potential for fireworks, and Gasly was so open towards the end of last year, wasn't he, about just how hard he's worked to make that relationship viable, that Gasly-Ocon feud that has existed for a very, very long time and is very deep-rooted.
Well, he characterised it as he'd basically done all the heavy lifting on that.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. Like how hard he has worked to make it work. So I just think if you as Alpine or Renault think Gasly is the number one here now, like he has come in and he's just got a bit more about him, and then I just think, does Ocon want to stay in that environment? And I don't think he does. So I can see a scenario here where Ocon wants out, and I have a team in mind that I think Ocon would be very high on the list for. So I think Gasly stays and Ocon leaves. And I think because correct me if I'm wrong, Ed, but I'm pretty sure this organisation was interested in him at some point. I can see a scenario whereby Valtteri Bottas doesn't have a future at Audi because he's too old, but he has another midfield move in him, and he's made it clear he wants to stick around in F1. He's a race winner. He's got loads of experience, and also he's a little bit anonymous, so he just ticks every box that Alpine wants from a Formula One.
A seat swap. You're proposing a seat swap.
You have guessed where I think Ocon goes.
Yeah, I mean, from my perspective, I think Gasly will stay, and I can see that Ocon scenario arising as well. So, provided Ben agrees, I think we've got Gasly inked in now for Alpine. Yeah, Ben nods, which is always good.
I agree with Gasly.
You've vocalised the nod. So it then comes down to, we'll come back to kind of where Ocon goes in a minute. So it's just working out that second driver. There's a lot of options. Bottas is one. Sergio Perez, I think, might interest them. Some Red Bull expertise to bring to the team. They might look at an Alex Albon as well if they can beat others to him. So there's a few options there for Alpine, I think.
Yeah, I think Albon would probably steer clear. I think he would be coveted enough, or maybe even just better off being Williams' team leader for a bit longer than going there alongside Gasly. So I'd rule that one out. Yeah, Bottas to Alpine.
Because we're at the point now where you're dealing with, as you move down the food chain, drivers are picking from fewer options, and and basically you have a chance of picking some veteran who's maybe best days in terms of results are behind them, or you take a young gun, or you take someone who's been around a bit and has maybe got some limitations, but if you can kind of play to their strengths, you can kind of moneyball your way to some great performances. So that's always a thing to bear in mind there.
I think also you just have, I do think you have quite a good complementing driver lineup there with Gasly and Bottas in terms of their relative strengths. For example, I can't see Team Enstone wanting Nico Hülkenberg back in the fold, because I think him versus Gasly is a little bit too much of the same thing, which is they'll do you occasionally great weekends, but they're also, how unlikely is it that they'll drive into each other or be a bit mardy or, just bring things down. I think that combination of Gasly Bottas is quite nice from a personal point of view, personality point of view. There's a bit of complementary elements there, but also just from a driver point of view, Gasly's just sort of younger guy who does look like he's really in a position to be strong for an upper midfield team and a works team. And Bottas, he just has enough currency about him. He's a multiple race winner. He's an ex-Mercedes driver. He to Alpine and Alpine to Bottas just feels like a good combination for them, because Alpine's just big enough in terms of it being Renault Group to give Bottas quite a nice, appealing deal that I don't see him getting anywhere else on the grid.
Yeah, he's probably one of the higher performing midfield drivers. I was going to make a case for Hülkenberg going back, but Scott shot that down for me, and I'm convinced actually that Bottas is a better bet there. Perez, I honestly think Perez is too damaged by his experience at Red Bull to be considered the right option there.
I can see Perez washing up somewhere. It's interesting.
I don't think Alpine though. I think it's close, but I think probably Bottas is in a scenario where Ocon wants out and gets out. Bottas is probably a number one contender.
Okay,
so, I'd agree with that lineup. Gasly, Bottas.
There's two Bottases there, so I will bow to the majority when it comes to that one. And obviously, as we're moving down the grid, it gets harder and harder because there's so many different knock-ons there's so many different dominoes we've had to kind of predict that the more extrapolations you make, the harder it becomes. So it's quite a tricky one. So we move on to Williams next. Obviously, the big question there is, can it keep hold of Alex Albon? And if not, what options do you think it has?
Oh, I think they're Albon or bust, aren't they, almost? Not quite, but I think they will do everything and are doing everything they can to keep Albon.
I think if they were doing everything they could, they maybe already could have gotten committed, to be honest.
You think?
I'm just not completely convinced. I don't know, I may be wrong, but...
What, and that the team wants to build around him, or that he's convinced about staying there?
I think the team wants to build around him, but he's, like I said, he's a driver who there's a lot of... we haven't actually slotted him in at one of the front half of the grid teams, funnily enough, but there's plenty of scenarios, because whenever any of these, if the unexpected happens, then there's Albon. He's a great contender for so many teams, I think. So
but it's got to be right for him as well, hasn't it?
Obviously, Williams will be blown out of the water by one of the top teams, no question. And then it comes down to a question: what happens in fiddling around here? So yeah, but yeah, the key question is: do they keep Albon? And I think of the remaining teams we've got, the big opposition there is Stake, who do like Albon, would be willing to pay him extremely well, give him a long-term deal. And then I think it comes down to which project do you prefer.
That's a good point.
That's an interesting question.
Yeah. And actually, he would, by doing that move, he wouldn't be automatic number 2, because obviously the top team scenarios we've discussed are all really Albon slots in if they have a gap, and it's alongside. He's a number 2. He's a number 2 or an emergency number 1 if something unexpected happens and a few people retire or just something. Yeah. So that's his value to the current race winning team. And he kind of has to weigh that up against being the big fish in the small pond at Williams. But I can accept that he might not have ultimate faith in the Williams pond to sustain life in the way that he wants, and maybe what will become the Audi team is actually a good punt for him. And of course, if we slotted Ocon in there, that would be quite a strong lineup for that team to have to build around for the Audi incoming, and it would be a good test of whether Albon is at the level we think he's at, because Ocon has shown he's a very good Formula 1 driver, but he's someone who's kind of been written off by a few top teams, hasn't he? Mercedes weren't convinced, let him go to Renault. Now it looks like Gasly's kind of edging him out of the Renault Alpine team. So you know what you're getting with Ocon. I think he's a very solid option, but he's not going to be necessarily the guy you automatically build around.
Yeah, I feel I think we've kind of got to bundle Stake in with this now. I think Albon Ocon is close to the optimum driver lineup that team can realistically get. Sainz is
I'd agree with that.
I'd say 2 from 3 of Albon Ocon Sainz is the ultimate, and I think Albon Ocon is the more likely. So
I agree.
That creates an interesting scenario whereby Williams then has a vacancy in one seat, and given Logan Sargent held on to the seat for this year by his fingertips, the big question there is whether it's an all-new driver lineup, and that's a very very interesting question.
So I then think in that scenario, because obviously we are talking about Williams, they go for Perez, who was linked with Williams many moons ago. I think Perez would be a decent option to slot in there as the experienced guy, the number 1, give him the love that he's been lacking or feels he's been lacking at Red Bull. And then they also replace Sargent, because I just don't think he's good enough. And they take Antonelli as the Mercedes high-powered rookie that they help blood in.
Yeah.
For future Lewis Hamilton succession planning.
Yeah, I certainly like the idea of Antonelli there. It's obviously a big ask. He's stepping up from Formula Regional Europe. Well, Formula Regional, he did Middle East as well, I think, last year. Won that as well, into F2. So that's a big ask for him in his first F2 season. But the whole thing of if you're good enough, you're old enough. And Verstappen showed how good you can be. And I think if I was James Vowles, I've written a piece about this before, that would be what I would be looking to do. Get Antonelli for a few years on loan, prep him for Mercedes, kind of do the George Russell thing. They got 3 years out of Russell, and that was 3 years when really George Russell was about the only good thing about Williams. So I think Antonelli is a great option. And yeah, Perez makes sense to me. I do wonder if there's a scenario whereby Perez could end up at Alpine and then Bottas goes back to Williams as the experienced hand.
I thought the same thing, but we're kind of locking in Bottas, aren't we, to Stake?
Well, we can swap. to Alpine rather.
To Alpine, yeah. So
yeah. Well, that seemed to be where he is. We can still shuffle around, but yeah, at the moment, well, both you and Scott went Bottas for Alpine. I can see that perfectly valid. So almost Bottas and Perez get sort of paired. I can see.
Or even Hulkenberg. I know I'm trying desperately to place him in every team, but again, he would be someone I think who would, by the end of 24, probably want to get out of Haas if there's an option. I mean, he tried. Stake, I think, wanted to get him, didn't they?
Well, I think he kind of becomes. I mentioned those 3 names for Stake. I think he's almost the 4th name in that, in terms of Sainz, Ocon, Albon, and Hulkenberg's the other one. Hulkenberg's age will count against him because they'll want someone that they can feel like they can build around for 5 years in an ideal world. Although teams are always looking for that long-term building around, and then it's not that often that drivers stay for stay for quite that long, but that's what they will be looking for. So yeah, it's an interesting thing, and obviously once again, teams like Williams are going to be well down the pecking order in terms of what's there. So you're looking at crumbs on the table.
Yeah, exactly. That's what I was about to say. So if they, in a scenario, I think which we are leaning towards, where Albon doesn't stay because there's better offers, then I think the only one they can really lock in is the Sargent replacement. And providing he goes well in F2 and does what Mercedes think he's capable of, I can definitely see Antonelli in the second seat. And then it's just a case of picking up whichever experienced driver is left on the market to replace Albon.
Yeah, which brings us to that Bottas or Perez kind of possibility. So, Scott, to bring you back in on this, we've talked about Williams. We're thinking we're going to end up with maybe Albon being tempted by the offer of stake, a long-term deal, the Audi project, some big money. Albon and Ocon end up at stake, and then it's going to be Antonelli, if he does well enough in F2, as the young gun with an experienced hand, maybe a Perez, or I know we've got him locked in at Alpine, a Bottas. So how do you think about that whole possibility? I think stake and Williams we kind of have to pair together, given the importance of Albon in that.
I'm a little bit worried about my privacy, to be honest, because I feel like you two have somehow hacked into my standalone document that I made for my original. Because I look at my screen right now and I have Williams, Perez, and Antonelli, stake, Albon, and Ocon. So I'm afraid I can't offer I can't offer a dissenting voice on this one. It makes a lot of sense because with Williams, I just feel like I think there's a chance Albon's already outgrown where that team's at. Or the recovery, because I don't see them making the step they need to this year to be on Albon's level in terms of where Albon is in the driver pecking order versus where Williams is in the team pecking order.
He was top 6 for us, wasn't he, last year, easily.
Yeah, exactly.
And Williams are not going to be a top 6 team.
And Williams overachieved by finishing 7th in 2023. So
because of Albon.
Yeah, exactly. So I just think they'll struggle to even replicate that.
His currency is at its highest as well since Red Bull. So he does need to cash in on that, I think.
Yeah, and I can absolutely see a James Vowles, Williams going, Antonelli, want a piece of that. More than happy to have him in a George Russell style drive. Perez being the experienced hand is the slightly more uncertain one. But one element, and I might be wrong on this, but one element I do wonder is, obviously we know that American side is very, very big for Williams. They're trying very hard there, and Perez is a very useful asset to have on that side. Not for the South American market, as Marco might think, but for the Northern American market.
Well, there's a couple of things there. Firstly, Perez has spoken to Williams in the past, and also Williams is very active commercially in the USA. Perez isn't an American driver, but there's a bit of regional connection there, so they might think that gives a little bit of
that seals the deal. Sargent out, Perez in. There we go, done.
So yeah, I mean, personally, if I was doing it purely based on mine, I'd probably flip it and go Bottas at Williams and Perez at Alpine, but I think it's really the same proposition there between those two. I think Williams, if they go the Antonelli route, and I think they should, because the upside of a driver like that is huge, and I think that's what they need to be looking for. You've got to pair them with someone experienced. The advantage, I think, from their perspective for Bottas is I think Bottas, we've seen the way he's worked with Joe at Sauber, at the Alfa Romeo stake, whatever we want to call it. So I think maybe Bottas will be favoured in that regard. Then it comes down to what Bottas likes the idea of, and maybe a return to Williams might amuse him, bookend his career that way. But certainly, if you've got Antonelli, you've got to have an experienced hand in the other seat.
I was going to say, actually, for Bottas, I think the fact that he's driven for Williams before counts against him in terms of what he'd want. Yeah. I think he'd like the idea of doing something new, and I think he even talked about that when he got to the end of his Mercedes deal and talked about moving to what was then Alfa Romeo. Obviously, there was a big money move on the table there. There was something, going and partnering with Fred Vasseur. He was very convinced that was the beneficial thing for him financially, but also competitively, because it was a more competitive proposition than Williams. But it was also about not going back and just treading over the same ground again. And yes, Williams is a very different proposition to what Bottas faced a couple of years ago. But I just think for what he has left in his F1 career, or what I think he probably has left in his F1 career, he's just going to get a bit more a bit more out of an Alpine move. Not necessarily competitively. There is definitely a possibility where in the next 2 or 3 years, the Williams-Alpine trajectories cross over. But I think just from a personal level, I think there's a bit more that Bottas can get out of that move.
I think even though it's been chaotic recently, Alpine is a surer bet right now than Williams is. I think Bottas's currency
It's still a works team.
Yeah, it's still a works team. The Bottas currency is still high enough. And also, let's not forget, he has gone on record saying he wants to be there for Audi coming in where he is now. So in a scenario where it doesn't look like they're going to want him, that I think that says to me his mindset is still, I'm a big deal enough to be in a big deal team, a works team. So if he can't stay at stake and be part of the Audi project, Alpine's the next best move. I don't think Williams seriously comes into that conversation. It feels like another move down the line when Bottas is in the kind of Raikkonen mercenary phase of just trying to eke his career out for as long as possible. And I don't think he's quite there yet.
It also comes down to what the teams perceive them as. There's been a few concerns that maybe Bottas is a little bit, sometimes a little bit distracted by off-track activities, etc., and that's played a part in his inconsistency. But then again,
he learned from Lewis, didn't he?
Then again, he's always been a bit inconsistent because he's not the most adaptable driver in the world, as we've said. When he's good, he's brilliant, but there's quite a few bad weekends in amongst with that, and he had a tremendous amount of bad luck last year as well. So there's a lot of questions there. Can he convince Stake Audi that he's the person to keep? He can't be discounted from that. And then if you're Alpine, well, do you want the experience, or do you think, actually we want to roll the dice on somebody on somebody younger? But I don't see,
not when they've got Gasly. I don't think so.
I don't get much impression that they're super excited about Doohan as an F1 race driver. Doohan was very fast in F2 last year, but didn't quite turn that into a title push. But that can't be ruled out. But and also in these teams, I think it's worth mentioning because we've kind of, without directly addressing him, we've written Joe out of stake, and given his appeal at the Chinese market, he's a good person to work with, good sensible driver, he'll have a few years of experience. We can't discount him as a potential, say, Williams driver or even Haas driver if they want to bring some money in. So we shouldn't completely discount Joe.
I was just about to say, I think he makes perfect sense for Gene Haas's version of what an F1 team needs to be. Because if that's an F1 team that's not going to get investment from its owner, it's got to get its investment from somewhere, right? I can 100% see a world in whereby someone like MoneyGram doesn't want to be part of a Gunter Steinerless Haas going forward, and that's a shortfall that's going to have to be made up somewhere. I genuinely don't think that team is as appealing commercially, because I just don't see how it's going to get talked about and get any TV coverage this year without Steiner, because he's pretty much the only interesting thing about them. So I can absolutely see Joe slotting into, I'm getting ahead of myself a little bit, but Joe slotting into Haas as like the more experienced
stealing my
option,
slot, Scott.
And then like an Ollie Behrman being the interesting left field high potential choice.
Well, let's make this the Haas thing then. Ben, what do you make of that? We've sort of tacitly written Kevin Magnussen out of that, which based on his performance in 2023 doesn't seem an unreasonable conclusion.
No, I'd written him out, actually. I think also because, he's very much a sort of Steiner hire, I think. So I can also, with the trajectory of that team, it looks very unconvincing. It's almost like rats fleeing a sinking ship, isn't it? So I could actually see both drivers being out at the end of 24. Magnussen first order and Hülkenberg second order. I think what Gene has...
if I had to bet on one driver to be there, I think it'd be Behrman.
Yes, that's what I was about to say. I think from what Gene Haas has said about, wanting to move even closer to Ferrari, that's the one thing he seems positive and active about doing. That and we know that Komatsu's a big fan of Behrman based on his FP1 appearances. So I think Behrman is absolutely their number one target for 2025. And then it's just who is available, who wants to be there on the cheap as well to slot in alongside him. And I can see Hülkenberg, the frustration he had at the end of last season with the direction the team was going in, that just persisting. So he just wants out, even if it means he's off the grid. And he'll try to get in as one of these experienced names at Stake, Alpine, Williams, and hope that he, ends up being the favoured choice over one of the other names we've mentioned. Magnussen, I think he's probably done after this season. I don't see a team going for him unless scenarios we haven't discussed happen whereby there's just a shortfall of drivers. He won't hang around to be a reserve, not with his family life and everything else taking precedent. So I think it's Bearman and probably, based on what Scott said, actually Zhou, who in my initial feeling was just going to drop off the grid. I think actually, yes, based on the need for that commercial angle, he's probably the best option for Haas on that basis. So it probably ends up being Zhou Bearman.
The one question mark I do have is just whether or not, and this sort of, not to take us back to discussing other teams again, but it's really interesting to see sort of whether any commercial need does mean that Hulkenberg's got no interest and no route into Haas. Because if Haas has a commercial need from the driver's side, then Hulkenberg's not going to have a route in there. If Haas has a commercial need on the driver's side, Hulkenberg's not going to want to be there. And then it's about, does he leave F1 again entirely, or could he take one of those experienced driver slots that we've mentioned, like we talked about it before, but like Alpine or Williams or whatever it would mean, going back to where he's driven before. I don't think it's impossible. Personally, I think it would depend on whether or not one of those teams would prefer a slightly steadier Perez Bottas type over a Hulkenberg, especially with some question marks over what he's like as a racing driver. But I just don't see. I personally think he wants out of Haas already. So I just don't see why he would stay there for next year. And I'm not 100% convinced that the new Haas team principal is a massive fan of Kevin Magnussen, because Komatsu has talked Magnussen up in a way in the last sort of 2 or 3 years. I remember speaking to him at the end of what we thought was Magnussen's last season. And he did say there that actually there's elements of Kevin's driving that has clearly improved in his time with us. He has got better at tyre management, and he has got better at judging a race drive. But there are still clearly limitations in his technique, and we saw that really badly with the car's weaknesses last year. So I think Komatsu's not going to be convinced that Magnussen's the right guy going forward. And I just think if Bearman's your hot shot and you just want that help pay the bills driver in the other car, then Joe's the area that Joe's an upgrade on Hulkenberg is probably the ease of working with him in the team. So I can see it happening for sure.
Or Perez is an option for them if he doesn't land at, say, Williams. I think we put Perez as maybe the number one contender for Williams, but say that's not rich enough for him. Maybe the US links being slightly more over Haas put him in the mix there. I think Perez is not going to have a great choice of options now that we've elbowed him out of Red Bull finally. But I could see him as a more convincing number one Haas option than Zhou.
I suspect though that it might be different. Perez might not be able to really commit to a team like Haas, given where it's at. It sounds like he wants to stay on the grid, and I think he can handle dropping down to the midfield. But if Haas goes the way we're fearing, then it might not
too much of a drop.
Yeah, exactly. I mean,
he's well backed though, isn't he? So he ticks that box in a way that Hulkenberg doesn't, that Bottas doesn't.
Yeah. I do think there's still a reasonable chance of Hulkenberg staying on, because he should perform well this season. He won't. He's one of those drivers who will end up... There's quite a few teams sort of in the middle of the pack and the back part of the pack who he'll be on the list for. But I think I can see Hulkenberg being a little bit too far down the list on most of those cases, but it depends on how things shuffle around. But he's not going to get the opportunity to be decently paid to race in F1 potentially anywhere else. So I can see him staying at Haas. If I was Haas and I was making it purely based on driver ability and what they offer, then I'd go Hulkenberg, Bearman. But yeah, Joe, who's a really good guy to work with, decent, consistent driver, works very, very well with teams. I think he could be quite good in that regard, and he'll work well with Bearman. So I think we're going with Joe for the commercial appeal element. But yeah, once we get this far down the grid, Haas are going to be the last team to have the choice ultimately, unless they do something unexpected this year, and even then, people are going to want to go to other teams. I think so. Yeah,
agreed.
That's the one. There's so many knock-on effects. It could end up being a completely different landscape. There's two other things we should remember. Firstly, that there's a number of drivers in F2 who could force their way into the equation. I mentioned actually Doohan, who's the Alpine reserve, who's not racing in F2 this year, but there's Victor Martin as well, who's the highest placed returnee to F2 this season. Very fast driver. Still perhaps needs to just continue to chip away at the consistency, but he's someone with ability. There's loads of drivers with alliances with F1 teams in F2.
Speaking of which, does Ferrari have any other prospects? We're getting very excited about Behrman, which I think is correct. But is there a scenario where Haas just becomes the Ferrari junior team in 25 and has Behrman plus another? I know Schwartzman's done a bit. Is he on the radar for Ferrari? Is there anyone else?
I think Schwartzman is absolutely going to be kind of a guy who does a lot of simulator work for Ferrari and has a long career probably racing Ferrari machinery of some sort elsewhere. So I don't see that. They've never really become that junior team, have they, for Ferrari? I don't know.
Really... But Steiner was resistant, wasn't he? Whereas I feel like Gene won't be. So
it may be. If Ferrari say, "Oh, look, we want this to happen, and we're prepared to help this happen financially," then maybe. But I don't see. Obviously, Dino Bogdanovic is probably the next most senior behind Behrman, but I don't see anyone making a compelling case for Ferrari to facilitate their path to F1 at the moment. I don't know if you agree with me on that, Scott. I think it's a few more years. It's going to be some of the younger ones coming through who might be able to make a case.
Not for 2025. I think someone like Bogdanovic would need to dominate F3 this year and then probably put up a really good F2 rookie showing, fighting for the title and winning races properly as an F2 rookie to really ignite enough momentum around him to get onto the grid. But even then, you're talking 2026 onwards. But Bogdanovic has had too long...
If Haas is still there.
yeah, exactly. Bogdanovic has had a bit too long kind of being really solid in junior Formula E, and there's clearly a good driver there. Is there an outstanding F1 level driver there? Not really convinced, but I just think Ferrari's not... I think, ultimately when you do these junior programs, you're looking for... What are you looking for? Probably like a driver for 4 or 5 years. That's kind of... It's okay, and Behrman's that sort of era of driver at the moment. So what Ferrari needs now is a mega driver. They just need someone that they can bank on that's coming out of karting or is in F4 or something like that. And they know that 3 or 4 years down the line, they'll have another one who's ready to slot in or maybe be in that position. I don't really think you need to stockpile your juniors, especially if you end up in a Red Bull situation where you stockpile 7 quite average drivers at sort of F2, F3 level. So no, I don't really think there's anyone else banging on the door. And it's the same at Alpine. That's why I haven't considered any of the juniors there. I just don't think any of them are good enough. It's the same reason Teo Pourchaire is not going to get a look in anywhere, even in the stake era of Sauber. They just aren't. They're F1 juniors, but how much? They're F1 juniors who are going to use that link to become professional drivers elsewhere. I think they'll improve. They'll get something out of it, but they're not going to get an F1 seat out of it.
And there's always the possibility that someone in F2 might rise and become a contender. Someone like Gabriel Bortoleto, who wasn't really hotly tipped as F3 rather. I've gone back in time. F3 champion last year.
Showing your age.
He had a handy record in Formula 4 and Formula Regional, and then he won F3, and so he's stepping up. I think he's McLaren aligned, Bortoleto, isn't he? So people like this, people like Zach O'Sullivan, who are Williams aligned. So there's always the possibility we could see something like that happen. The other confounding factor we have to bear in mind is the Andretti possibility. Obviously, the FIA said they can have the 11th entry. They still seem to be thinking they could be on the grid in 2025 in their own right. That would astonish me if that happens now. But
only if Gene Haas sells, I think, now.
Exactly, yeah. So there's always the possibility that will change things. Let's say Haas was sold to Andretti or something, that would change things significantly, I would say. But again, that's another one of those confounding factors. And I think probably what you can say from this is because right from the very start, even in the seemingly most stable lineup, there's endless curveballs that can be thrown in that just completely change the whole playing field. Tells you what potential there is for this to be a fascinating driver market. I'm sure that our predicted lineup, based on what we know now and what we can anticipate, is not going to come to pass, but we've just tried to base it on the most likely things that are going to happen. So I'll just review it and then give Scott and Ben the chance if they want to swap anyone round. We've got Red Bull, Verstappen and Ricciardo, Mercedes, Hamilton and Russell, Ferrari, Leclerc and Sainz, McLaren, Norris and Piastri, Aston Martin, Alonso, Stroll, Alpine, Pierre Gasly, Valtteri Bottas, Williams, Perez and Andrea Kimi Antonelli, AlphaTauri, Lawson and Tsunoda, Stake, Albon and Ocon, Haas, Joe and Ollie Behrman. Anyone having any late regrets or wanting to swap anyone around there, or do you think that's as good as we're going to get it?
Not regrets. I don't think regrets. I think there's a degree of the obvious one that could slot in somewhere is Hulkenberg, but I just think the different circumstances around him and where he is now, just that makes it a bit. It's just realistic, that he drops in the same way as when he dropped off the grid the first time, right? Is you could have seen various areas that he slotted on the grid and stayed in Formula One, but it just didn't happen because he's just probably not going to be anyone's first choice, and you just never quite end up as enough of a priority to stay on. I mean, the big one in terms of the doubt is Aston, Alonso and Stroll, but I think there's enough there to be fairly content that we've gone with continuity there. That's the area I can see circumstances through 2024 changing most.
Exactly, and it has so much knock-on effect that it's the lower we go down the list, the more chance there is for there to be changes ultimately. And the one thing we can say though is that the driver pool is quite small, unless you want to bring in an experienced driver, and obviously there's so little opportunity for testing and running that's quite a big gamble, which is why we've only suggested 2 rookies, which is better than this year, but it means it takes quite a lot for newcomers to come in, even though most of these teams have got all manner of juniors scattered around the foothills of F1.
The 2 that I wanted to see on the grid, Antonelli and Behrman, are on our list, so that's a big box ticked for me. I do think Sargent should drop off. And I think, even though I've tried to place Hulkenberg at pretty much every team, I do concede that effectively he and Magnussen are both emergency stopgap drivers that came in under unforeseen circumstances. So it kind of makes sense that they would drop off once those circumstances change significantly. And
Hulkenberg turns 37 this year, and that's why he can only exist really as a slot-in, safe pair of hands option, which would be the result of a knock-on effect. I think there's a reasonable chance he'll still be on the grid, but he's just not in a mighty position at this stage. That might change as time goes on.
Yeah, I don't think he's anyone's number one choice, is he? I mean, also he wasn't Haas's number one choice. They wanted Ricciardo, who obviously at that time decided he wasn't interested in making that kind of drop down the grid. So
a very good move on his part.
So yes, so I think ultimately in the game of musical chairs, Hulkenberg and Magnussen, now that Steiner's gone and the direction that team is changing, I think both of them drop off. So yeah, Sargent, Hulkenberg and Magnussen are the 3 that fall off, aren't they?
Exactly, yeah. And there's, I guess, the other name we should throw into the mix very briefly is Mick Schumacher, who is on Mercedes' books. Obviously, he seems to be heading sports cars, but I can't see a scenario where Mick Schumacher becomes a driver. He's perfectly decent, but I just don't see him having what he needs to eclipse any of the other drivers in terms of getting points.
Does he even get a shot if Hamilton retires at an awkward time and they just need a stopgap for a year alongside Russell? I don't really.
I think if you're Mercedes and you need a stopgap in that situation, you'd be better off picking up a more experienced driver or Bottas or someone like that if he's willing to do it.
I think they would be able to find somebody, wouldn't they? He was contractually available at short notice. So yeah,
I think his Mercedes chance would be
weekend.
Can't do a couple of races. So Or you go, you get pitched in.
Yeah, Daniel Ricciardo hand injury type event. Yeah, I think Schumacher's just there for marketing purposes, isn't he? And he's going to go off and do WEC, and that's about right for him. So yeah, I don't think he's a serious factor for anyone really.
Right, well, I think we've covered off all the eventualities. Like we say, this is predicted based on what we extrapolate may happen. It's almost certainly not going to be accurate, but hopefully it's given everyone a bit of an impression of what the lay of the land is in terms of this. And obviously the way things work is the bigger teams tend to get things sorted out earlier. So I guess Ferrari is the obvious one at the front of the queue. We think Leclerc's pretty much a done deal anyway. And it sounds, Fred Vasseur said before Christmas he'd quite like to get it sorted before the season starts. So it's not impossible Leclerc and Sainz could be confirmed before the season. But if they don't confirm their full lineup, then that Sainz scenario that's been talked about that Scott put forward could be coming to pass.
Whatever scenario Scott's put forward, we know is not going to happen. He made that disclaimer at the start of the podcast, so all you have to do is listen back, and whatever he said is going to happen won't happen.
Exactly. But if there is a Sainz move, then that sort of has such a big knock-on effect. It skittles all our predictions. So, let's see how accurate we are. I can pretty much guarantee that won't be the lineup, but it's a rational and extrapolatable order for next year based on what we know now. Well, thanks very much, Scott and Ben, for playing the prediction game. Head to therace.com. Don't forget the hyphen, loads to read there on F1 and the rest of the world of motorsport. Check out our other podcasts, including Bring Back V10s, which tells classic F1 stories. That's in its 9th season right now. The Race F1 Tech Show with the legend that is Gary Anderson, our IndyCar, Formula E and MotoGP podcasts as well. And if video's your thing, head to YouTube, where we've got long and short form videos. Well, we're going to sit back and see how the driver market plays out, but we'll be back soon with everything you need to know from the world of Formula One.
The Athletic.